here if anyone is chatting about research. And I'm also coming down with some kind of cold here, so unfortunately I can't shout. My throat is kind of killing me. But can you guys hear me in the back? Yeah, okay. So in this talk, I'm going to present a Bayesian nonparametric approach to modeling brain activation patterns. And parts of this work are joint work with David Dunson at Duke and Alana Fish and Tom Mitchell at CMU. So in general, my interests are in modeling complex time series. And there are many aspects of time series data that can present challenges to standard time series models. I'm just going to run through a few in this talk. One is the fact that the time series may exhibit long-range correlations, actually non-linear and even non-Markovian dynamics. So for example, here we show 3 replicates of observing the same underlying univariate process. And from this, you can clearly see how there are these long-range dependencies. Well, in a multivariate setting, typically there are changing correlations between the different elements of the time series, and it's challenging to capture this. And finally, sometimes we're in what's called a functional data analysis setting, where we get multiple observations of the same underlying process, such as what we showed here, and a goal might be to share information between these different replicates in order to find, for example, some kind of global trend. Okay, well, one data set that I find really interesting that actually exhibits all of these different features is MEG data. And I won't go into the details of the recording mechanism, but you can think of it somewhat as a hybrid between EEG and fMRI. So a person sits in this chair and wears this helmet that has 102 spatially distributed sensors that provide recordings of the magnetic field that's induced by the underlying neuronal activity. And okay, someone else wants to get the word. Okay. So often this recording mechanism is used in studies of human cognition. So, for example, we might be interested in how does the brain encode different concepts. And in such a case, maybe the person is shown a word, such as cow, and in response to this, we get this 102-dimensional time series at a very high temporal resolution. Then in the study, maybe a person showed a different word, like apple, and we get a different 102-dimensional response to this stimulus. So in order to understand the difference between the responses to these different stimuli, it's very important to be able to model the brain activation pattern. Well, this data is clearly high-dimensional, and in addition, there are long-range dependencies. So for example, there's this famous N100 response time that occurs roughly 100 milliseconds after the time of stimulus onset. So there's a long memory to this process. Oops, sorry. And in addition, there are time-varying correlations between these 102 sensors. And this is induced by the changing coactivation pattern of the brain as the person is, in this case, semantically processing the word. Yeah.
How long is 100 milliseconds on the time series?
How long is 100? Like, how many samples do we get in that 100 milliseconds? That's good. I think it's 1.5 samples per millisecond. I have to look back.
Around 100.
What?
Around 100.
A bit, yeah, we get a bit more than 100, but around that much. Okay, well, in addition to this application, the data are very noisy because this recording mechanism, it's non-invasive. So typically, what's done to cope with the low signal to noise ratio is we record multiple recordings for a given stimulus, such as the word cow. So this puts us in this functional data analysis setting. And the goal might be to capture some kind of common global trajectory in the face of significant trial-to-trial variability. So just to get a sense of this variability, let's just look at the recordings from one sensor in response to one word. So here we show one, sometimes these replicates are called trials. Okay, so I'll use that word. Here's one trial's data. Here's another trial. And here we show 20 different trials from which we see significant noise, significant trial-to-trial variability, but clearly there's a common global trend. Okay, well, traditional approaches to modeling this type of data have typically relied on just doing maximum likelihood estimation, averaging over all of our different trials, and this assumes independence over time as well as a very simplistic model for the trial-to-trial variability. In addition, the approaches tend to model every channel, so every sensor's time series independently. Clearly, there are correlations between the sensors in this application. So, of course, we're interested in if we actually capture the features of this data in this way, can we do better in modeling these time series? Okay, so we're just going to step through each one of the data challenges that I presented in order to motivate our modeling approach. And the first is how to cope with the fact that we have this noisy data. Well, clearly there are temporal dynamics that we'd like to capture here. And we can assume that in the absence of this significant noise, that the underlying trajectory that we wish to model can be approximated as some smooth function with long-range dependencies. And so here the goal is to share information both across time and between these different trials. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, I'm less familiar with this application.
Yes.
Is this kind of like one bit of information, like there's only one bit and that's all that's relevant? Or is that
Oh no, it's a whole trend. Well, relevant, we're going to get to what the task is later, but let's just think of it as, to begin with, before we get to what the actual task is, which I haven't actually mentioned, let's just think of capturing the overall trend of this thing. It's not just that. This feature will be important, but actually this feature is shared between almost every response to a given stimulus. It's just a visual response. So it's other features of the data that are going to be important. So yeah, capturing this would be, well, anyway, we'll get back to that. But think of the whole trajectory as being of interest. Okay, so to capture the type of features that I'm describing, we're going to look at employing a set of Gaussian processes. So just as a very quick tutorial on Gaussian processes, and this probably won't be helpful if you haven't already seen it, so I apologize ahead of time, but it's just high level, which is a Gaussian process is a distribution of functions, and it's uniquely defined by a mean function and a covariance function. And by definition of the Gaussian process, if you look at this function, evaluate it at some set of locations, so perhaps some set of time points, well, that's normally distributed with mean given by evaluating the mean function at those locations, and then building up this kernel matrix. So, for example, a common approach is just to use a squared exponential radial basis function, shown here, for the covariance function. And here there's a variance parameter that controls how much the function can deviate from the mean. And then there's this length scale parameter that has to do with smoothness of these Gaussian processes. So just to visualize this, so this covariance function, here's a draw from a Gaussian process with a high length scale, which you see is rather smooth, low length scale, much more jaggedy. Then for the mean function, well, perhaps we assume that there's some underlying linear trend. So we could define this as our mean, and then all of our draws from the Gaussian process will be functions centered around that mean. We can also assume some much more complicated form for the mean, and then each of our Gaussian processes will be centered around this. Well, we can also look at defining hierarchies of Gaussian processes. So for example, maybe we assume we don't know what this mean function is, and so we can model it itself with the draw from a Gaussian process, and then center a whole collection of Gaussian processes around this mean. We're going to use this in our modeling approach later. Okay, so that was a quick little overview about Gaussian processes, and they're going to be the building block for the models that we're looking at. And now let's turn to this issue of coping with the dimensionality of this time series. So one thing to note is that in this application, there's inherent redundancy between these spatially distributed sensors. And in addition, the correlation between these sensors, so in essence, how the redundancy plays out, can sometimes be very long range. For example, because of bilateral activation patterns. So it's not just a function of spatial proximity to other sensors. So in such scenarios, what we can do is we can actually harness lower dimensional embeddings of the dynamics. In particular, we're going to look at using dynamic latent factor models. So before we explain our dynamic latent factor approach, let's just look at standard latent factor models. And here we're going to assume that we have IID, zero mean normally distributed data, that's p-dimensional. Okay, so this is a p-dimensional vector. Just remember that this covariance matrix here, it captures the correlations between the different elements of this p-dimensional observation. Well, this covariance matrix, sigma in general, has some p times p plus 1 over 2 unique elements. And for p very large, this is going to represent quite a large number of parameters. A latent factor model assumes that this large covariance matrix can be decomposed into a low rank component plus a diagonal. Okay, so the rank here, k, is assumed to be much, much less than p. So now we have some p times k plus 1 unique elements to model. And one can arrive at this covariance decomposition by assuming the following conditionally linear Gaussian form for our observations, where our observations are modeled in terms of some latent k-dimensional, independent, normally distributed latent factor that's projected up to our observations with some factor loadings matrix, plus some idiosyncratic noise, so it's just independent across the components of our observation vector. So marginalizing these latent factors induces this covariance decomposition. So just some pictures, what I'm saying is that we have these latent factors defined in this k-dimensional space, and they're getting projected up to our p-dimensional observation. So the standard latent factor model assumes that each of our latent factors is independently distributed. So we draw this latent factor, project up, define its corresponding observation, and do this independently for each observation. Well, clearly in our application, there's temporal correlations, right? These observations are not independent over time. So to capture these temporal dependencies, we're going to introduce dynamics on the latent factors themselves. In particular, we're going to introduce some set of k latent Gaussian processes that capture a nonparametric evolution to the latent factors. Then each of these latent factors that now has some temporal dynamics to it gets projected up to form our observations. So just to make this a bit more concrete, these might represent our 102 sensor measurements, and these might represent some set of, in essence, latent responses to this stimulus. So the projection operator, remember, is this factor loadings matrix lambda. And so by using these latent Gaussian processes here, we're capturing a time-varying mean in our process. Okay. Well, now let's turn to the problem of modeling the fact that the correlations between the dimensions, so between these 102 sensors, changes with time. And that's induced by the changing coactivation pattern in the brain. So just to make this a little bit more concrete, let's just look at a little cartoon that shows what I mean just for 2 out of the 102 sensors. So what I'm saying is that maybe early on in the time series, sensor 1 and sensor 2 are highly correlated, but this correlation decreases with time. Well, how we're going to capture this type of, first infer this from the data and capture this in this 102 dimensional space. Remember, we have a 102 by 102 dimensional covariance matrix, is quite challenging. So just remember that in the latent factor model we described, we're harnessing the fact that we are going to approximate this p by p covariance matrix in terms of the low rank decomposition. But remember here that we're looking at a static covariance matrix, so the correlations between our observations are not changing with the observation. Okay, but now what we're going to look at is a covariance matrix that changes with time. So we're using x to denote some continuous time index, but in general could represent some other covariate like space or age or any covariate you might have, potentially multivariate. And these types of models are referred to as heteroscedastic. Okay, well, motivated by the ideas of our latent factor model and the dimensionality reduction that we got from that, we're going to look at predictor dependent. So in this case, our predictor is just time, but I'll refer to it just as a generic predictor. So predictor dependent covariances that are based off of predictor dependent factor loadings. Okay, so just in terms of pictures, what I mean is we have this P times K dimensional factor loadings matrix that we want to somehow model as evolving over time in this dimension here. And so the way we're going to do that is, again, employing a collection of Gaussian processes to define generically some set of dictionary elements. And so to build up this predictor-dependent covariance, we multiply this matrix times its transpose and add a diagonal component. Okay, so just remember, this is the conditionally linear model associated with this predictor-dependent latent factor model. And going to this latent factor model is helpful in coping with the dimensionality of the problem, but it really only got us so far. So let's just consider a toy example where maybe we have 5,000 dimensional observations, and very conservatively, we're going to assume a latent factor dimension of just 50. Well, this still results in us having to model 100,000 latent dictionary functions. So that represents quite a challenge. So we're going to go one step further, and instead assume that this factor loadings matrix can be modeled with a much smaller collection of dictionary elements. So some L times K. So think of L as roughly on the order of K. And that's times some non-predictor dependent weightings matrix.
P was the number of sensors.
Exactly. So P, you can think of it as 102 in our application. K and L I haven't defined, but think of them as much smaller. Okay, so this conditionally linear model produces the following predictor-dependent covariance decomposition. So again, in pictures, what we're saying is that this P times K factor loadings matrix, we're going to assume that we can model it as a weighted collection of a much smaller set of dictionary functions. Okay, well, up to this point, I've simply motivated the decomposition of our covariance matrix. Now I'm going to specify the priors that we use on the various components here. So I already alluded to the fact that for this latent dictionary, we're going to assume that each of these functions is a draw from the Gaussian process. And in this case, we're going to use the squared exponential radial basis function. And then for the weightings matrix, we're going to use the shrinkage prior, Bodikari and Dunson. I won't go into the details. There's not much that you need to know about this other than the fact that the prior encourages shrinking these columns towards 0 as the column index increases. And so what that means is that as you walk down the rows of our latent dictionary, well, the functions become less and less important in forming the overall covariance because their weights are getting shrunk to 0. So this provides some regularization, so some flexibility in the choice of L, this one latent dimension. And then for this idiosyncratic noise, we use standard inverse gamma priors on these diagonal components. Okay, so now let's look at building in this type of heteroscedasticity into the dynamic latent factor model that I presented. So in particular, the factor loadings, which used to just be that static lambda matrix, we're now assuming has the following form. So it's a time-dependent form. So what this means is that at any given time slice, we evaluate the dictionary functions at that point, multiply by this theta matrix to define our projection operator, to project our latent factors up to our observations. Then at the next time slice, we compute our evolved projection operator and keep doing this over time. And so what we're capturing is the fact that this projection operator, it changes with time to capture the changing correlations between the dimensions of our observation. And we're doing it in terms of this latent k-dimensional subspace. Okay, so now jointly this formulation allows not only for a time-varying mean, but also a time-varying covariance. So just to get a sense of what we're able to infer using this type of model, I'm going to show a movie where we're looking at the correlations between this sensor and every other sensor as a function of time in response to the word kick. Okay, so what you can see is that we're able to capture these changing correlation patterns that result from the changing coactivation pattern of the brain as the person semantically processing this word. We're going to show that this is really key for the inferential task, which I still haven't described. It's a surprise. Okay, now let's go to the final challenge, which is capturing this trial-to-trial variability. So remember that each one of our trials is a noisy observation of the same underlying process. And each one of these trials is going to deviate more than sometimes quite significantly. And so the goal is to share information between these trials in order to capture a global commonality in terms of what the response is to a given stimulus. And for this, we're going to employ a collection of Gaussian process hierarchies, just like I described at the beginning of the talk. Okay, so just remember, this is where we ended up for modeling a single trial's data. Well, now we have a whole collection of trials. And what we're going to do is, in order to capture this trial-to-trial variability and efficiently share information between the trials, we're going to introduce a set of latent parent functions. So we introduce k Gaussian processes, and each of these Gaussian processes that we defined before is going to be centered around this parent. So said another way, when we look at projecting those latent functions up to our observation space, what we're doing is, and I guess I should mention that we're coupling together all of the trials for a given stimulus. So we have a word-specific model, and we're defining a word-specific mean process. And then each one of our trials has a mean process that's some deviation away from this shared mean process. And this allows us to share information between these trials. So just as a visualization of what we infer using this type of model, well, in green I'm showing, again, just one trial's data. And in cyan, this is the parent function projected up to the observation space. And in dark blue, this is the child function specific to this trial. So what you see is that it clearly deviates from the parent, but it has shared features. For example, that strong dip down that was mentioned earlier. But if we look at another trial, and so again, this is coupled. This is, if you flip back and forth, this cyan line is exactly the same between these two blocks. But we have a different trial, and here, the child function tends to be bounded below from the parent. So using this formulation, we can capture the significant variability, but still pick up on these strong commonalities between the trials. Again, here, and there are other locations as well. Okay, so let's finally get to the surprise task. And the task is going to be to perform word classification from a single trial MEG recording. So what I mean is a person's shown a word, we get a single recording of that word, and we want to classify which category of word it came from. So in particular, we have 4 different word categories: animals, food, tools, and buildings. And for each one of these categories, there are 5 words that we have, such as cow, dog, and so on for animals. And for each one of the words, we get 20 repetitions of the person seeing that word and semantically parsing it. And we're going to look at using 15 of these trials for training and holding out 5 in order to test our classification performance. Yeah?
I'm just wondering if there's ways you control for like the sound of the word or the other things.
No, so that's part of the response that's unique to a word is, and we'll get to this later, I'm going to show a difference between the response to the word hammer versus the word house. So this isn't necessarily the sound of the word. There's definitely differences between lengths of words. People can decode words of length 3 extremely rapidly, much quicker than longer words. But also for different types of words, words that evoke senses of home versus actions, there's different responses. But that's what we're trying to capture, is the difference in these responses.
I guess I was wondering how you know you're not just capturing some sort of variability in the different categories, phonemes or...
I mean, so I guess I don't know enough about the application domain to like answer that level of the question, but I would guess that there's enough variability within the words animals and to kind of balance out over that not all animal words have a certain pattern compared to other words.
But if you only have 5. category.
Yeah, I mean, you can, so, of course, like, we could be picking up on the fact that it's gray outside, right? There's all these things that, standard issues when you're looking at classification, but this was a pretty controlled study where they interleave the words. You're not looking, there are tons of issues, of course, when you're looking at responses, brain activity, people have habituation and different things like that, but I didn't do this recording, there were professionals that did, so. Was there another question? Yeah.
Were the words spoken to them or shown to them on?
So there are a bunch of different applications, and I'm trying to, I think in this case, it was exactly what I showed before, where you got a picture of the word, like the cow, and the text of the word. So they run a lot of experiments, and they're different. Sometimes it's just said, different combinations, but I think in this case it was picture and text. Okay. So we're going to look at classification performance. And just to recall, so for each one of the word stimuli, we built this word-specific model that has a time-varying mean and a time-varying covariance. And so this time-varying mean is going to use this hierarchy to capture the trend of how variability, share information between them. And this time-varying covariance, we're going to show that our formulation was really key to classification performance. And both of these use these latent collection of Gaussian processes, as well as a latent k-dimensional subspace. Okay, so here's a summary of our performance. And so we looked at two different subjects, so two people sitting in this chair and going through this experiment. And remember here that because our task is just categorization into one of 4 different categories, chance is 25%. And again, because each one of these trials is really noisy, it's a very challenging task to do single trial MEG classification. So don't expect large numbers in terms of performance here. And what we're showing here is that if we take the standard approach of just doing maximum likelihood estimation, just average all the trials, assume a static covariance matrix. In one case, our classification performance is barely above chance. The other subject is actually below chance. Neither of these were statistically significant. And here we're showing the same thing, but now allowing for a time-varying covariance, specifically estimated using a kernel-based method. And in this case, we see definitely marked improvement. So capturing heteroscedasticity is key. That's before we even touch our model. But we can see it's definitely the largest performance is using our proposed method that not only captures heteroscedasticity, but it efficiently shares information between the trials and harnesses this latent k-dimensional subspace. And this even outperforms this powerful discriminant-based classifier in SVM. Okay, so let's just, yeah.
So for SVM, what are the inputs? Does the SVM aware of time changes or no?
So the input was a vector over time. It was a very, very large feature. Okay, so let's just get a sense of why capturing heteroscedasticity is important. I know it's. But we're just going to show some correlation maps here. And on the top row of this plot, we have the correlation between this sensor and the occipital lobe and every other sensor. And on the bottom row, it's between this sensor and the parietal lobe and every other sensor. And we're looking at a snapshot at 101 milliseconds. And each column, this column corresponds to the word hammer, and this column to the word house. Okay, well, when we look at this time, which is really early in the response, we see very similar structure between these estimated correlations. And that actually makes sense because this is during what's called a perceptual response. So it's before people have actually processed the meaning of the word. So it's not surprising that the correlations are similar. But if we look later in the time series, 401 milliseconds, which falls basically in the middle of what's called the semantic processing window, when people should begin to start processing the word, we see very different correlation structures. For example, for this word hammer, you see this strong bilateral activation pattern, and it's hypothesized that this is related to motor cortex activation associated with the word hammer, which I think maybe when you see that word, you think of an action and you get activation there. But capturing this differential structure is what's really key in our classification performance. Because what this allows is it allows sharing of information that changes over time. Okay, so it was really nice to see that this Bayesian approach, capturing trial-to-trial variability and heteroscedasticity, was key to our classification performance, and actually provides the gold standard for that application right now. But I started to do a bit more exploratory data analysis, and got a bit concerned that the Gaussian processes we were employing were smoothing out key features of the data. So in particular, yes, we were right to assume that there were these long-range correlations. The process is not well modeled as Markov, and it's reasonable to assume that there's locally stationary and smooth dynamics. However, the thing that we missed was the fact that there are these abrupt changes. And in particular, the key thing here is the fact that the long-range correlations present in this data actually span these change points. So things that happen early on in the time series influence those that happen much later, even though there are these intermediary shifts in dynamics. And so this is in contrast to most change point models, which would assume complete change to some new process after the change point. Okay, so in order to see this from the data, one thing you can look at is just the sample correlation matrix. And so in this part of the talk, we're just going to look at data from a single sensor. And so we're looking at 20 trials of the data from a single sensor, and we're computing the sample correlation matrix. And what you can see is that there are clearly long-range dependencies and abrupt changes, which you can see from the blockiness of this matrix. And the structure also motivates us to model this process as locally smooth with additive noise. Okay, so in order to capture these features, we're going to present something that we call the multi-resolution Gaussian process. In particular, we're going to start by modeling a single function that has these types of long-range correlations and abrupt changes as a hierarchical layering of Gaussian processes. And then a bit later, we're going to return to the functional data analysis setting and think of how to have common global trends in the face of the trial-to-trial variability. Okay, well, the top level of our hierarchy is going to start by just defining a draw from a Gaussian process. So this parent function, it defines the smooth local trajectory, long-range correlations, non-Markovian dynamics, and if we stopped here, it would define a stationary process, of course, assuming a stationary covariance function. And again, if we evaluate this function at some set of locations based on the 2-second tutorial at the beginning of the talk, this function is normally distributed, and the correlation matrix is going to look something like this, assuming that squared exponential covariance function. Okay, well, in order to introduce abrupt changes, we're going to introduce a set of change points organized in a hierarchical fashion. And at the top level, so each one of these change points is going to define a break in stationarity. So at the top level, we split this input space, and then independently over each one of these partition sets, we're going to draw a Gaussian process that's centered about the parent function, just restricted to that set. Okay, so we draw this function, and then independently draw this function. Well, both of these functions, yeah.
Is that breakpoint part of what you learn, or is that just arbitrary?
Yes,
right?
we're going to learn this. So, and I'm going to get to that in a couple minutes. But for now, for this part of the talk, assume somebody magically told you where the change points were, and let's just look at how we layer the Gaussian processes. That's a very good question, but we're going to take the fully Bayesian approach, assume those are unknown, and do inference over those. Okay, but assume somebody tells you where to put these breakpoints for the time being. Okay, well, each one of these functions is smooth, just like its parent, but not necessarily with this abrupt change at this partition point. Then, again, this function, the joint function, evaluated at some set of locations, conditioned on the parent, because these things were drawn independently, is going to have this block diagonal structure. And this process recurses where at every level, we somehow split the parent partition, and then independently draw Gaussian processes centered above each one of their parents. So again, looking at this function, given its parent, the correlation matrix is going to have this block diagonal structure. Okay, so this process we terminated at some level capital L and define a terminal function, g, as the resulting function at that level. And then we assume that our observations are just noisy measurements of this terminal function. Well, one nice thing about this specification is that conditioned on this hierarchical partition, we can analytically marginalize all of these latent Gaussian processes, and we can look at the induced distribution on this terminal function g itself, just conditioned on the partition points. And using standard Gaussian results, you can show that g is itself a draw on a Gaussian process with a partition-dependent and thus non-stationary covariance function. So if we look at g evaluated at some set of locations, it's normally distributed with correlation matrix simply given by the sum of all the correlation matrices we had before. It's an additive process. So from this, we can see how there are long-range dependencies that span the change points, as well as abrupt changes, these quick drops in correlation. Okay, so let's just get a little bit more intuition about this correlation structure. And so to do this, let's look at, assume we're looking at two observations at some locations, xi and xj. Well, the correlation that's induced from this top level GP is just a function of the distance between these observations, assuming a stationary covariance function. In general, it's given by just evaluating this kernel at these locations. Then at the next level, the correlation that's added is, again, based on this, evaluating this covariance function. But once we get to the third level, well, these locations fall into separate partitions at that level, and so these functions were drawn independently, so there's no added correlation. So overall, if we look at the correlation between these observations as this form in general, but the key thing here is that Lij is the lowest level in the tree for which observations Yi and Yj fall into the same partition set. So what you see is that the correlation spans the change points, these abrupt changes in the process, and we get higher correlation for observations that share more levels of the tree. Okay, well, of course, the properties of this process are very dependent on how we specify the covariance function for each one of the individual Gaussian processes. And so for this, for our multi-resolution GP, we're going to assume that each one of the GPs uses a squared exponential kernel. This is going to lead to smooth functions. And we're furthermore going to assume that this bandwidth parameter is shared between each of the GPs. And specifically, it's going to be scaled by the size of the partition set. So what we mean, it's going to create this fractal-like process where if we zoom in on the function, it's going to be locally as smooth as its parent. So making that partition set the same size as the parent partition set, this function has the same smoothness properties as the parent. And so what this means is that lower levels of the tree are going to capture more detailed information about the function. So this provides this multi-resolution interpretation. Then for this variance parameter, we're going to assume that it's absolutely, yeah. No, it's fine.
So is this always the kind of correlation that you want? Because it seems like all of the additional correlation is being added is something that's going to be relatively local compared to the earlier layers. So the global correlation is always going to be divided, so you're adding, you're creating more correlation, but there might be, especially when you look at that one large matrix, it seems like there are bits that are quite far away from each other that have stronger correlation than some of these local regions.
Yes, absolutely. And there are ways you can induce more interesting correlation structure through even just playing around with the way these things are defined. I've chosen one specification that leads to one correlation structure, but you can put priors, like for example, if you put a spiking slab prior on this variance parameter, so you let sometimes the variance be 0, it's going to force that function to be exactly equal to its parent. So you can drop out adding any difference from that. And so there are many ways you can structure it. A lot of work, honestly, still to be done here. This is a lot of work in defining more flexible partitionings and ways to define the non-stationarity. There are ways that you can define the GP so you don't necessarily have a discontinuity, just breaking stationarity, forcing these little GP widths to be 0 at the endpoints. So tons and tons of possible things. But yeah, this does have a very specific form for how you're capturing that change. It was motivated by the MEG data, but it doesn't capture every feature of that process. Okay, so in our specification, we're going to assume that this variance parameter is absolutely square summable. And what this means is that this terminal function g is going to have finite variance regardless of tree depth. What it also means is that lower levels of the tree are less influential in defining this process because they're forced to be closer and closer to their parent. So these abrupt changes stochastically are getting smaller. Okay, well, up to this, yeah.
Excuse me. So about like new correlations that you can introduce in the previous slide, there is a difference in this modeling between the middle half and like the two halves of like both sides, right? Because you're bisecting the whole line, and then there is a difference between close points that are in the middle and close points that are in one of the halves, right?
You're saying how likely they are to be split?
So I'm trying to say that maybe one more way to do the splitting is allowing for overlapping groups in there,
right,
not just bisecting. And then doing overlapping, I think the machinery, I mean, it's not clear to me how the machinery would work if there's if you allow for overlapping groups there.
I mean, so I mean, there are different ways you could specify it at the intersection, but I mean, you could still have an additive process that would be fine with those overlaps. So I mean, it is interesting to think of not necessarily just having these bisections, but again, the formulation we chose was looking at this MEG data where you did see first these very nice kind of well, within certain lower levels they're pretty balanced, which we're going to get to. But also this fact that there is this change. It's not like a kind of a like smooth shift to something else, which I think is what you're getting at if there's overlap. I guess, I mean, depending on what you're saying in terms of what happens during that overlap, you could define different properties, right?
I'm saying that would you still have this additivity in there when you have overlapping groups?
It depends how you would define what happens in that overlap region. Like if you define the function to be the sum of those functions, then yeah.
I see.
Right. So I mean, it just depends. I've defined functions where you say every function is centered around its parent. You can change this to a fully additive process where it's equivalent. You just define everything as the deviation from the parent, and it just sums over the tree depths. And then you can think of other structures using that. Yeah. Okay. So let's return to this functional data analysis setting where you have multiple related functions. Using this multi-resolution GP, there's many ways you can capture shared information between these. But again, we're going to look at motivating it from this MEG application. And for this, we're going to assume that there's a shared parent function and a shared hierarchical partition, so shared abrupt changes between these different trials. And then each one of these trial-specific processes, these other GPs are going to be independent draws for each one of our J different trials. So in pictures, what I'm saying is we have the shared parent function, then we independently draw these different trials data, but each one of these have these shared partitions. So let's just look at what what draws from the prior of this process look like. So on the top row, I'm again showing this MEG data. Here it's just 3 trials, and the sample correlation matrix estimated from 20. And on the bottom row, I'm showing a draw from this multi-resolution GP, where here, these 3 trials drawn, but the sample correlation matrix is estimated from 100.
And are you fixing the partition points here? Or are you
Those were just drawn correctly. Yeah. So from this, you see pretty strikingly similar structure, considering that these are just draws from the prior. You see this wonkiness to the correlation matrix. And in terms of the trajectories themselves, you see periods of much more variability or closer connections between these functions and similar levels of jackiness in essence. Okay, well, again, in this scenario, we can harness the conditional conjugacy properties of the Gaussian processes and condition, again, on this hierarchical partition and the shared parent function. We can analytically marginalize all these latent GPs. And so we can think of drawing each trial's data just given the shared parent function. And that's just from a normal distribution, where this sum over these correlation matrices captures that blocky structure. Okay, so using that, there are a lot of things we can compute in closed form. One is we can look at the posterior distribution of this shared parent function, so the common global trajectory. Kind of think of it as like a DC signal. You step back and just what's going on in the absence of this trial-to-trial variability and abrupt changes. So the posterior distribution of this function, just condition on these trial data. And you can also look at predictive distribution on a new trials data, condition on the data that you've observed so far, and in this case also analytically marginalizing the parent function. So this is just condition on the hierarchical partition. But the really key thing is the fact that we can compute the marginal likelihood just given the hierarchical partition. So this is the likelihood of all of the data that we've seen, condition on this partition A. And because we can compute this in closed form, we can perform very efficient inference of the hierarchical partition itself. So this goes back to this point of we're not going to assume that we know the change points. Instead, we're going to place a prior on them. And I'm not going to go into the details of our specification. It's pretty standard, but there are many different specifications you can look at. But then given that we can compute this marginal likelihood in closed form, we can look at doing things like the importance sampling or independence chain MCMC. And so for this requires defining some type of proposal distribution for the partition. And just remember that we can think of this partition in this simplistic way defined so far as a balanced binary tree. Those are binary splits at every level. Okay, well in general, stochastic tree search tends to be rather inefficient. But here we can harness the very specific correlation structure induced from this multi-resolution GP. And in particular, what we want is a method that hierarchically looks for drops in correlation in order to propose our partition points. So we can think of this as a graph cutting problem, where every node in the graph represents a different time point, and the weights between these nodes, the weights of these edges, correspond to the correlation between the observations at these different time points. So what we're looking for are cuts of the graph with low edge weight. And in particular, we like, based on the structure of this data, fairly balanced cuts. We want to avoid cutting off small, disconnected components. And so one technique for doing this is looking at normalized cuts. And so here we're going to take our cost matrix to be the absolute value of the sample correlation matrix. And then the normalized cut metric says that the cost of a cut, such as the one shown here, is the sum of the weights in this yellow box times the reciprocal of the sum of the weights in the orange box and the green box. And what this does is it balances between encouraging cutting small edge weights and penalizing cuts of disconnected components. Okay, so we can use this to hierarchically partition our input space by first performing a cut at the top level, then recursing on each one of these submatrices and cutting each of them, and recursing down the tree. Okay, well, using that type of recursive minimization, we produce cuts that look, or hierarchical partitions that look like this. So this is for level 7 tree from this MEG data. Okay, well, this algorithm that I've presented so far assumes that you're deterministically choosing this cut point. But instead, we're going to use this normalized cut metric in the proposal distribution. We're going to solve an assignment and say that the probability of choosing a cut point is inversely proportional to the normalized cut cost of that cut point. Okay, so now we have every component we need for example, our independence chain MCMC. And I just want to mention that the complexity of computing this marginal likelihood is order n cubed, where n is the number of locations that we had, number of time points. So that's exactly the same as in a normal GP, which makes sense because we have something that's a GP, which is with the structured covariance function. And then for our proposal distribution, using this normalized cuts procedure, the complexity of each proposal is order n squared L minus 1. That's using some efficient dynamic programming techniques there. And in addition to proposing global repartitions of this entire input space, you can also do local node proposals. Okay, so now let's return to this MEG data. And here, our interest, we're not going to look at classification, we're just going to look at fit of this model to the data and interpretability of the change points. And so for this, we're just going to look at 10 words. And again, each word, we have 20 repetitions of that word. We're going to use 15 of them for inferring this hierarchical partition. So I just want to emphasize, the only thing that we need to do inference over is the hierarchical partition, because we can analytically marginalize all the GPs. So that's what we're using these training trials for. And then we're going to hold out 5 in order to look at the fit, the predictive fit. So here, for these experiments, we're looking at every word and every sensor independently. We're not sharing information between them in this case. Okay, so one thing we can look at are inferred change points. And we're just going to look at the change points at the top level as the most significant change points. We're going to aggregate all of the inferred change points within each of 4 different lobes: the visual, frontal, parietal, and temporal. So each row of this plot corresponds to a different word, and you can think of that row as being an image of the histogram of the inferred change points. And so what we see is that, I should point out that 0 in these plots corresponds to the time of stimulus onset. Okay, so what we see is that in the visual cortex, the change points occur earliest. And that makes sense for this type of visual word stimulus. And here we're showing this N100 response time. And that's the point, it's been shown, by which people can decode word length. And what you see is a lot of agreement between the mode of our inferred change points and that famous N100 response time. But if we look at the temporal lobe, which is very important in processing the meaning of a word, we see change points that occur much later, mostly within this semantic processing window of 250 to 600 milliseconds. And there are similar stories for the other lobes as well, but I won't go into those. But what I want to look at is the fit. So in particular, we're going to compare this multi-resolution Gaussian process to a model where we just have a single Gaussian process, and every trial is assumed to be a noisy observation of this underlying function. Then we're also going to compare to a 2-level hierarchical Gaussian process, just like the ones we showed at the beginning of the talk, where there's a shared parent function and every trial has its own GP. Yeah.
Are the covariances changing with time in these?
Yeah. So each of these, every GP, every little green function you see here is a drop of a square GP with a square exponential kernel. We are going to optimize the hyperparameters. So we're not fixing them to be the same. We optimize the hyperparameters separately for each of these scenarios. But it is assuming, that's the key thing, is these are assuming stationary processes here. So here, we're not capturing trial-to-trial variability in any structured manner and no abrupt changes. And here, we have the trial-to-trial variability, but no abrupt changes, no non-stationarities. Okay, so we're going to look at performance in terms of the percent decrease in mean squared error of held-out predictions as a function of the conditioning point. So what I mean is that we're going to condition on the trial's data up to a certain point and look at the prediction of the next held-out chunk. And what we see is that relative to the Gaussian process, we have a significant decrease in mean squared error in every scenario. But when we look at the much more flexible hierarchical Gaussian process, we also see decrease in mean squared error, everything except these points here, which are pretty small, but most significantly in the visual cortex early on in the time series, because the visual cortex sensors represent those with the most non-stationary behavior. So another thing we can look at is predictions of entire held-out trajectories. So for example, here we're showing data from a visual cortex sensor, and in green is the empirical mean of these different trials, and in blue is the posterior predicted mean using the hierarchical GP, and in red are multi-resolution GP. So what you can see is the predictions are actually fairly close, except using this multi-resolution GP, we're able to capture this quick drop down around that 100 millisecond point, that the hierarchical GP smooths over. Okay, so finally, we compare to the wavelet-based functional mix model of Morris and Carroll. So this is a pretty common approach to looking at functional data with these types of spiky trajectories. It allows sharing of information between multiple related functions. So it's pretty appropriate for this type of application, but here in this plot we're looking at held out log likelihood of entire trajectories. This is aggregating over sensors and words. So you can see that the multi-resolution GP clearly has a better fit to this data in terms of this predictive held out likelihood. A couple things to note. One is the wavelet-based method assumes a regular grid of observations. So that might be fine in some applications, such as our MEG data here, because it occurs on this regular grid, but that's not true in all applications. But on the other hand, this wavelet method has a really nice way of coping with multivariate data that we're not harnessing here, which is looking at univariate processes. Okay, so in summary, we look at these methods of learning latent hierarchies of Gaussian processes to define time-varying mean and time-varying covariance, and an ability to capture this trial-to-trial variability. We looked at the performance in terms of this task of doing word classification from single trial MEG data. And in the second half of the talk, we looked at defining Gaussian processes that better capture the features of this MEG data, which include these long-range correlations that span these abrupt change points. And for future work, of course, we could build in these types of dictionary elements into the types of models we showed at the beginning of the talk. Okay. Thank you.
I'm really curious about the model complexity. So by the time you set up your hierarchy and then you've learned all of the learnable parameters, how many parameters is that over the covariance matrices, et cetera?
So I get that question all the time from reviewers. How many parameters is it, right? But that's the thing, it's hard to count parameters when you're, so actually, and I didn't go through this, with this data matrix, this weightings matrix, I actually define it as infinite dimensional. It's P by infinity. I have this regularization prior that's shrinking after a certain point, the columns to 0. So number of parameters, infinity, right? So like the naive answer to your question is there's no hope of learning anything because we have infinitely many parameters. We're defining things in function spaces. Those are defined by infinitely many parameters, right? But it's the specific choice that regularizes against that. So unfortunately, in these applications, it's really hard to count parameters. But I mean, we can talk about the complexity of doing the computations themselves. And I should say that it's not trivial using standard Gaussian processes. It's order n cubed for each. I mean, okay, there's so many different caveats, and that's why I didn't get into computations in this talk. But with hierarchies of Gaussian processes, just like we saw on the multi-resolution GP, there's additional conjugacy. So you don't necessarily have to sample. You don't have to sample each of the GPs. So it's not like every little GP you saw in this picture, we have an order n cubed operation. It's simpler than that. But it's still the case that as you get very long time series, your computations scale as order n cubed. And so that presents a challenge. But correlations also decrease. So there are lots of techniques with Gaussian processes, harnessing band-limited structure. And in this hierarchical, or this multi-resolution GP, once you condition on, for example, the parent function, the computations are ordered, they're independent given that, so they're much smaller computational order. So there are lots of tricks you can play, but I mean, computations are, I should say, no harder than in most Gaussian process-based models, but that's not saying much. Computations of Gaussian processes are challenging. So I don't know if that got to your question.
Whenever I look at fairly diverse modeling methods being applied to an identical problem, I like to kind of mentally say, oh yeah, that's simple, that has very few parameters.
Yeah.
Even an SDM in there, which is.
Let me defend myself a little bit more on that. Yeah.
Hey, just an estimate of the effectiveness.
Sure. So I want to emphasize that in the dynamic latent factor model, we have this conditionally linear model. you can do really, really nice things with that. And actually, all of our sampling is based off of conjugate updates. So we have closed form conjugate updates, and they're all samples, like every step, except for the hyperparameters, are draws from a multi-foot variant normal distribution. So in terms of implementation, it's trivial. But it just depends. And like I said, again, the computationally intensive step is how long of a time series are we looking at? Because there's going to be a draw from a Gaussian of dimension n. So I'd say at first glance, it actually looks quite complicated, all these different parts, but when you write down the formulas for your posterior computations, you're in the world of conditionally linear Gaussian models. So things aren't quite as scary as they seem. And in this multi-resolution GP, like I said, you're never actually touching the Gaussian process itself. You're just doing inference of the hierarchical partition, and everything else is closed form. So you always have to harness any conditional conjugacies you can. It shrinks your search space. I mean, lots of caveats here. Take my class in the winter now. There's no quick answer to any of these things, unfortunately.
But I think the previous question was not about, maybe I misunderstood it, but it was similar to mine. It's simply, regardless of computation, suppose you have infinite anytime, it doesn't matter.
Just complexity.
Complexity model. On the previous picture, does it make sense to compare likelihoods of these two models? Or do you just, that relates to the question of number of parameters. Are we comparing
They
apples to
actually
apples?
are. This other one is a wavelet-based method that's based on underlying Gaussian processes that are decomposed in a wavelet domain, and certain components are shrunk to zero.
But if the effective number of parameters are not matching between the two models,
But the held out likelihood, it's test likelihood. It's not. So let me be clear. So a couple answers. Yes, the models are comparable in terms of being based on Gaussian processes. And second, we're looking at test likelihood. This is held out data. So of course, I mean, we have more parameters. We're going to do better on training the likelihood. But this is looking at held out trajectories.
Well, yeah, I mean, I understand that it held out. You don't optimize over them, but they likelihood to mean different things. I'm not sure why I would compare them. I don't know. Maybe but it's maybe my ignorance.
Okay. Well, I think. Yeah, I mean, we can talk more about it, but they're put on the same scale, I should say, but in terms of, yeah, it's in essence, we can go through it a little bit more, but yeah.
Did you compare those methods on the classification performance, on the classification test?
So yes and no, I didn't do it within the full model. I did look at whether, just based on, so the only difference, right, is where the partition points happen, and I did look at whether, and here each channel, we're back to this simplistic domain where every channel is modeled independently, and if you do that and test classification between words, you actually don't see a significant difference. So this gets to the fact that what we're modeling here in this second half is really a different model for the mean. But as we saw in the classification, it was really the covariance that was key. So there's like some small difference, but it wasn't enough to like have any surprising conclusion. But for classification, I mean, like the big take-home message is it's really important to share information between dimensions and to allow that to change with time. So treating every channel independently is just going to kill you for classification. And the other thing is that a lot of the change points are pretty similar between the different word stimuli, especially, for example, the visual cortex. You get the same kind of abrupt dip down, regardless of stimulus type, and that's going to swamp you in terms of the overall likelihood.
So the way that you're exploiting the correlation should allow you to deal with missing data, which happens a lot in that domain.
Yeah.
Have you done that, or?
Yes. Actually, the original talk, if it wasn't going to be on brain data, it's all about missing data.
Oh, okay.
So it's very cool. The covariance model that we have, you can analytically deal with missing data. What I mean is you can analytically marginalize all of the missing data, so you don't rely on imputing it from the full data likelihood in order to have closed form posteriors. So it's really nice. You can cope with irregular grids of observations. And we showed with some work on flu estimates of flu activity in different regions. And in that case, we had tons and tons of missing data. that you can very nicely cope with it. So that's a very good point. Yeah.
So I guess the main reason for efficiency is the fact that ultimately it's just one GP and it's just some equation. And I'm not sure that I completely understood the nominal cut, but it seems to me that you could generalize that to not just have a tree, but have even formulations maybe.
Yes.
So that would account for your off-diagonal issues, right?
Right.
Right now your off-diagonal can only be less than.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that possible, or am I missing something about that? Is it
So,
possible
so that's the thing. I mean, if you allow for different cut structures, you could allow for that kind of having more correlation pop up elsewhere instead of having it just be monotonically decreasing as you're going further away. Though, truthfully, in most time series applications, you have some type of structure like that. Though, of course, the interesting cases where you don't, you have something come up much later after a complete drop in correlation. So it's interesting.
Actually, the same question, which is, I think, I mean, you could possibly do some sort of, in segmentation models that do multi-label, they sort of label partition refinement, and since the correlation structure is just additive anyway, it's still have all the next one.
Right, exactly. So that, yeah, I mean, this, like I said, this is like very recent work, just, you know, a couple months ago for this multi-resolution GP, and the main point is thinking of introducing a set of partition points and GPs over them to capture different correlation structure. There's just a lot of things I'd like to look at in terms of more interesting structure than this, you know, first step.
Thank you so much.